The stars dimmed like lanterns in wind, and the galaxy's breath scraped over ruined citadels as if urging them to sing once more. On the ash plains of Moan, a coronation pyre burned in a hue that meant both birth and expiry, while the empire lined the horizon like a rumour afraid of itself. Within the palace waited the immurent, a ring pretending to be a line, a promise pretending not to be a prison. I was to step inside it, know that we truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. He stood before the immurent and called himself Seraphel, though the court had woven more titles than one breath could carry. The mirrors set in the door showed not one face but a procession, each bent by a different decision, each bearing a future with a different wound. Outside the pyre sang for storms, and the crowd knelt because fear and reverence share a posture. Curl of the outer phalanx entered, the pale crescent on his cheek recording a beam that decided against love. Your Radiance, he said, apology folding the honorific. Dawn presses, Curl said. The Silex envoy circles and counts our windows. Let dawn wait, Seraphel answered. When you pledged me your life on the stair of salt, what did you think I wanted? Kel measured. Continuance, a line that does not break, a people who refuse to kneel. And if the line is a ring, Seraphel asked. If continuance is a corridor without windows? He touched the raised Ouroboros. His fingertip tingled as though frost learned his name. The immurent preserves, he said. It does not forgive. The tutor would say a door that never opens is a wall, Cale answered. Iriel believes names must change, or they spoil. Where is he? Preparing the star urns, Cale said. He reminded me of the parable of glass. All vessels for eternity must first be melted. Seraphel had seen glass from the bones of beaches and cities vitrified by want. If immortality were a vessel, whose sand would he burn? Iriel entered carrying 2 urns, pale threads braided into brief constellations above their lips. I brought memory, he said, for your choosing. His hair was the white left when a sea goes elsewhere. Kyle, keep the world from interrupting us. Kyle bowed and withdrew. This one holds your victories, Iriel said, touching the left with a finger that trembled like an old sword recalling its work. This one holds your failures. Breathe either smoke, and you will judge accordingly. If I breathe neither, then the air will judge you. His gaze went to the immurent as to a sleeping tide. You ask what must be melted. You ask whether a ring is only a line in disguise. What do you fear losing? My name, Seraphel said, and those who anchor it when I drift. Then teach your name to swim, Iriel said, or chain it to an anvil and drown sooner. He touched the mirror's rim. For an instant, his reflection doubled, and his eyes looked wet with that impossible thing, hope. Do not enter to hide from endings. Enter if you mean to carry them. Endings carry themselves, Seraphel said. He crouched by the victory's urn. The glaze painted him crimson, a conqueror haloed by ash light. The failure's urn offered a mourner who had not learned the names of the dead. He rose, older than his chronicle. The Silex will demand concessions. You will speak in debts. Kyle will measure the door. The living owe the dead an honest arithmetic, Iriel replied. Keep your columns neat. Seraphel remembered reeds and brine, an oath before an older city, and faces he did not save because saving them would have prolonged a war by a single indifferent day. He remembered letters unsent to the one person who spoke his unadorned name. Open it, he said. The immurent's hatch sighed, drawing heat and giving back cold. 1,000 indistinct petitions clung to the air, as if every ancestor had gathered to speak with one mouth. Within was a hall of possible thrones, empty and rhymed with the frost of halted time. Seraphel set one foot on the threshold and felt his pulse divide. One rhythm eager, one afraid. Kyle's voice came muffled beyond the door. Envoys advance, then lower. Forgive me. For what? He asked, not turning. For being the cliff, Kyle said, and silence reclaimed its chair. The mirror seemed to say, without sound, I will not be kind. I will only be true. Seraphel inhaled. The chamber listened, counting heartbeats like coins dropped into deep water one by one. The smoke of victories, the smoke of failures. He took neither. He let unflavored air scald him with iron and winter. If I become imperishable, he whispered, let it be because I learned to answer, not to evade. He stepped forward and felt the machine notice him as a deep sea notices a swimmer. Outside, Moen's rim reddened. The pyre's hymn slid into dissonance, and somewhere a bell tired of restraint threw its weight down a shaft. Across the ash plateau, nobles pivoted toward a door few could see. Seraphel glanced back once. Iriel rested a hand on the hatch, not urging, not restraining, simply counting. Keep the ledgers, Seraphel said. When the Psyllics speak, tell them I will answer with something heavier than breath. Winter is a star that forgot to rise, Iriel said. Go. Seraphel crossed the threshold. The Immurant closed its mouth upon him like a calm, patient beast. He thought of a crown that would never cool, and of hands that might never again know the weight of a mortal hour. Then the floor fell, and the Hall of Thrones lifted into a sky made from halted choices, and in the widening hush he understood the first cost of desire. A name must be melted before it can be a vessel, and an empire must be thinned like glass to survive its own reflection. The ash sunrise over Moen came on like a bruise, and the palace chimed to keep courage from evaporating with the dew. Iriel waited beside the Immurant's cold door, inscribing numbers in the air with a stylus of light, counting the breaths Seraphel had taken since the seal closed, while Karl stood in the corridor with his helm beneath his arm and his apology caged behind his teeth. Courtiers drifted past like fragments of mirror, each reflecting a future that would never arrive. A navigator who tasted dust on starlight, a magistrate in robes sewn from tabulated prayers, a priest carrying moths in a jar of sleep. 901, Iriel whispered, and erased the shining tally. He is teaching time its manners. Kel looked at the door as if it were a cliff and his oath the sea. Or time is teaching him to count what leaves, he said. He wondered which would arrive first, the Psyllics' envoys or regret. Trumpets shaped like questions unfurled down the western ramps. Banners rattled. The ash plain threw back an answer that sounded like a ledger closing. The Psyllics' processional stepped from their shuttles in increments of 9, as if a single breath could be broken into obedient parts. At their front walked a thin woman whose coat was lined with scribed vellum and whose wrist bore tiny abaci that clicked when she blinked. I am Vera of the 9th account, she said to Cal in a voice that had balanced cities. We bring terms. We bring patience, Cal replied, and put his helm on, for one speaks differently when metal is listening. You will address the tutor until the Emperor returns. Vera measured Iriel with a stare that had never seen a tide refuse a moon. The tutor knows subtraction, she said. That will help. Iriel smiled in the way that meant he would rather not. Your sums are welcome, he said, if they leave room for a remainder. He led them through the courts, past the statuary of broken hours, to the Hall of Murals, where victories were arranged to look like virtues. You will find our terms are modest, Vera said, letting her bone clock hover at her shoulder like a tame hawk. A tithe of futures, a census of griefs, and the renunciation of any permanence that excludes an audit. Kyle heard the clock and thought of the stare of salt, of bandages that would not cling because blood had made a sea of his hands. He bled there, he said under breath. Ariel replied under the same breath. He laughed there. They shared a memory and then hid it as one hides a knife after deciding not to use it. The nobles gathered as if practicing the art of leaving without moving. Lady Meris, whose hair was threaded with comet wire, proposed a coalition to restrain the Empire from eating its own horizon. Lord Andon of the Inland Engines promised garrisons in exchange for rights to number the sky. A boy with ink on his fingertips asked Ariel whether the sun could be persuaded to sign a non-aggression pact. Only if the night sues, Ariel said, and the boy believed him because youth mistakes wit for weather. Kyle moved among them like a shoreline, holding just long enough to draw maps on, then withdrawing before they blamed him for the sand. He watched Vera touch the murals, pressing gently where paint had lifted into curls. Your triumphs flake, she said. So do our failures, Kel answered. And yet we eat. Near the immurent, a small choir assembled under Iriel's hand. Sing a minor prophecy, he told them. Not the grand chord, only the smallest true tone. They sang in a ring, their breath catching in the cold that did not belong to weather. The floor sweated, the walls forgot to echo, and a single sentence burned itself into the stone between them. When the cliff forgives the sea forgets the shore. About mercy, Carl asked. About habits, Iriel said. Mercy is a habit of endings. He considered the door and the breath tallies he had erased. He must return with pockets full of endings. In the chamber beyond the immurent seal, Seraphel walked among versions of his name. One asked why a crown needed hooks. One asked why hands were so eager to become walls. He declined the smoke of victories and the smoke of failures, and breathed only the iron air. And his lungs learned a grammar that did not excuse him. He found a balcony overlooking hours suspended like lanterns, each containing a face he had not saved, and he watched the lanterns frost over from within. I will carry you, he said to none, and 1,000 ended lights answered like snow becoming rain. Outside, the ash plain rehearsed silence. Vera kept counting. Nobles tied loyalties like temporary bridges and wrote letters to people they planned to betray. Kyle dismissed the phalanx to the outer courts and placed his ungloved palm on the door. If you return as the ring wants, he told the frost without speaking, I will be the cliff. If you return as a man who remembers how to end, I will be the shore. The door sighed, steam fled, and Seraphel stepped out carrying a stillness that silenced other stillness for pretending. He looked at Iriel first, at Kale second, at the murals last. They are cheaper than they look, he said, and the murals seem to wilt. Iriel offered him a goblet of plain heat. Seraphel drank and handed it back, and knew with the precision of a cut that there were fingers he would never hold warm again. The 9th account requests tithes, Vera said, bowing by bending a column of numbers until it resembled respect. Then let us speak of rumours, not futures, Seraphel answered, and of names we have not yet learned, not griefs we pretend are counted. As to permanence that fears an audit, I will renounce every wall that calls itself a door. Vera's abachi clicked like teeth. Bring an ink that keeps its promises, she said. They moved, beneath the pyre's sagging hymn. Seraphel signed as if carving a door where a wall had pretended to be sufficient. The ink dried like midnight. Wind rose and moved only through the hall of murals, lifting a curl from the oldest painting and setting it adrift, a leaf reluctant to fall. The bone clock stopped, then conceded a notch, and somewhere a tide found a new appetite. "Your empire is fevered," Vera murmured. "So is yours," Seraphel said, and her mouth admitted the mathematics of that truth. When she left, the court loosened its throat. The nobles began to breathe like people who had remembered debt is a form of love. Kyle approached and removed his helm. "Forgive me," he said, without clothes for the word. "For what?" Seraphel asked. "For being the cliff," Kyle said. "Then be it," Seraphel answered. "But cliffs crumble if they do not learn the shoreline's patience." Ariel brushed chalk from his sleeve. "The smallest truthful thing has been sung," he said. "Do you want the larger?" Seraphel looked at the immurent and did not. He looked instead at his friend and his guard and the ash morning and nodded toward the stairs. "We climb," he said. On the first landing, a moth escaped the priest's jar and burned itself in daylight, which is a quiet prophecy. On the second, a star in the mural went out, and no one noticed until it was needed. On the third, a child in comet wire whispered to an absent mother, promising to become a ledger that could forgive. Before they reached the fourth, a messenger arrived from the inland engines, breath like sifted iron. "My lords," he said, "a name has been found carved into a gate that should have no name at all." "Whose?" Kyle asked. "Yours," the messenger said to Seraphel, and then, after breaking like glass in a gentle hand, "and also the word betray." The ash sunrise darkened by an inch, and the palace chimed again, as if to keep courage from remembering it could leave. The message hung in the corridor like a stopped breath, and Seraphel read the carved fragments until iron learned his silence. On a nameless gate, the letters Seraphel had been cut with patient geometry, and beneath them the smaller word betray, a mark as narrow and exact as a needle through a heart. Kyle stood between messenger and stair, with the stillness of a cliff that knows the sea by all its first names, helm tucked beneath his arm like a second, less forgiving face. Ariel counted breaths on his fingers and then erased the tally, refusing to gift the hour a ledger it had not earned. Vera of the ninth account arrived with her abachi drawn taut as bowstrings. "Someone writes in assets and liabilities," she said, studying the strokes, "and intends to balance your name against a debt." Seraphel placed his palm near the letters. The metal cooled under his heat, the way old doors prefer memories to hands. "If this is warning," he murmured, "someone loves me without permission." "If this is provocation," Cal said, "someone loves your absence more." Ariel touched the smaller word without touching it. "Betrayal is a door that refuses to call itself a wall," he said softly. "Sometimes it is the only polite word a wound can pronounce." Seraphel stepped back, not because he feared the letters, but because he had been here before in a room inside the immurent, on a balcony of halted hours, watching lanterns frost around faces he should have carried. The frost spoke in the same thin hand. "Bring me to the gate," he said, and the corridor exhaled as though finally allowed to move. They went the long way to the inland engines, through corridors where murals ended and stone forgot to flatter. The gate waited at a junction of conduits stamped with extinct crests, a slab that had been only weight until someone introduced it to meaning. Seraphel gleamed. Betray drank light. "We could melt it," the foreman said, and relief rehearsed itself in his shoulders. "Melt the witness," Vera answered, "and future knives will write in softer places." Carl asked for the list of those who tended this junction. The foreman unrolled names until the air sagged. One name arrived with a shadow longer than its syllables. Maris. She came with Sarah Illith at her side. Illith of the Choir of Minor Prophecies, throat faintly bruised by song, eyes holding the exhaustion of someone who had handed herself to a note and found the note heavy. "I did not carve this," Maris said, before accusations could learn their lines, "but I could have loved the one who did." Illith lifted her gaze to Seraphel and did not defend herself from it. "I wrote on the first gate," she said, voice the softness of ash when it remembers fire. "I saw a door pretending to be a wall. I wanted it to learn how to speak." Carl's hand found his sword hilt and rested there without vanity. And the smaller word? Illith's mouth had a bruise of thought. Names without the risk of betrayal become prisons that speak politeness as law. Seraphil tasted halted hours. "Then teach me," he said, and Illith's gaze did not flinch. She set her palm a finger's width from the seam that had masqueraded as patience. Mechanisms unlearned by their makers woke with careful courtesy. A line inhaled. Air flowed from within, carrying the iron flavor of rooms that keep ledgers with their own breath. "Behind this," Illith said, "the inland engines stored records from before the guilds learned arrogance. They speak of a corridor that loops through decisions and returns carrying altered names." Kel entered first, not as spear, but as shore, absorbing the first wave and measuring panic. Ariel came with the lamp. Vera walked where the floor sounded honest. Maris kept her hands unclasped in case the metal asked for persuasion. The passage was an artery of brushed alloy lit by breaths rather than lamps. Alcoves displayed tools, arranged by intentions. A crown dismantled into patient teeth, labelled with words that could be virtues or kindnesses, depending on weather. A mirror that refused reflection and showed only the hour's pulse. "This place fears forgetting," Ariel said. "It records until mercy becomes arithmetic." The artery emptied into a chamber held up by dead engines like penitent giants. Upon a second slab, the name appeared again, and beneath it the smaller word, newly bright. Before it stood a man unhelmed and pale, wearing Seraphel's height and economy, his patience gathered in the shoulders, his weariness rearranged into elegance. He turned when Kyle allowed his step to be heard. The resemblance finished its arithmetic. "You are late," the other said with Seraphel's voice drained of warmth. "I went ahead to spare you the part where you decide slowly." Kyle lifted shield and vow together, occupying the space where haste invents grief. "Name yourself," he said, not to demand, but to offer a bridge. "I am the answer your patience refused," the other replied. "The Empire can be saved from its ring by a clean betrayal. I have signed the ledger in places you were too tender to visit." Vera's beads clicked like rain educating dust. "Duplicate entries," she murmured, both irritated and impressed. Ariel raised the lamp and braided two shadows into one longer doubt. "He is not a ghost," the tutor said. "He is a road that took a different turn and returned with the same dust." Kyle interposed shield and vow. The other's blade rang once, pure as a ledger, and the shield learned respect. Maris flung a loop of comet wire that remembered stars. It tangled the blade long enough for Ariel to press the lamp against steel and make it doubt its own edge. Vera spoke 3 numbers as if they were laws, and the seam in the slab held still. Seraphel caught his double's wrist. Their pulses argued in one skin. "If you are me," he said, "you know the ledgers I owe." "If I am you," the other answered, "I know the ledgers you fear, and I will pay them before they invent new interest." Illith sang a single line into the air, the smallest truthful thing. The engines shivered like animals remembering harness, and the chamber's angles softened until the blade lost a fraction of its certainty. "There is more than one mercy," she said. "One ends tomorrow. Another writes it with a hand that has learned restraint." The other looked at her as if regret had finally found a body that would admit it. "Small prayers," he said, and tried to smile with someone else's mouth. "But necessary," Iriel answered. The other looked at Illith as if regret had finally found a body. He stepped back without surrender, ghosted by a wind that had forgotten its weather, and the resemblance broke where humility would not follow. "You have allies I did not purchase," he said. "Then pay a different way," Seraphel answered, and released the wrist. No strike followed. The double glanced at Curl the way a tide considers a cliff, at Vera as if numbers could be bribed, at Meris with a patience sharpened for unkind futures, at Illith with a caution that knew better than contempt, and then at the sealed seam as if it were a promise that might yet remember how to open. "I will return when you have chosen whether your name is a line or a ring," he said, and moved into the corridor, leaving behind the smell of iron and a thought that had not completed itself. Behind the sealed seam, the engines muttered like sleepers who remember drowning. Above, the palace bells tried to keep courage from wandering. Seraphel touched the carved letters once, promised to learn endings properly, and said, very softly, that tomorrow would not forgive anyone who hurried too soon. The chamber of dead engines still whispered in their iron sleep as Seraphel emerged, the echoes of his double trailing him like a shadow that would not yield to light. Cal kept pace at his side, shield heavy with questions, while Iriel carried the lamp close, its flame reluctant, as if it too feared what they had seen. Behind them, Vera counted each step, muttering numbers that promised an account even for breath, and Meris held Illith's hand for steadiness, though her own eyes shook with fury. The palace gates accepted them back into morning, but the light had soured. Ash drifted as if the sky rehearsed funerals before anyone had agreed to die. Nobles waited in closed silence, and when they saw Seraphel's face, they bowed not in loyalty, but in calculation, gauging what had returned. He walked past them, his silence thicker than decree, and entered the hall of murals where old victories flaked onto the floor like scabs from forgotten wounds. Iriel leaned his lamp against a cracked pillar and addressed the gathering. "A likeness has risen," he said, voice thin with restraint. "It claims his name. It claims the empire can only be preserved through betrayal." The words travelled through the hall like sparks crawling across oil. Murmurs bled into mutters. Some faces brightened, others shadowed. Carl's hand found the hilt of his sword, as though ready to silence rumour with steel. But Seraphel only stared at the mural of the Stair of Salt, where his younger self laughed against blood, and he whispered, "How long has the echo been walking ahead of me?" Vera stepped forward, Abachi trembling with their own quiet arithmetic. Duplication in ledgers breeds collapse. Either you erase the false entry, or you reconcile the debt it brings. Her gaze pierced him. "Which will you do?" He turned, slow as stone shifting, and met her eyes. "Erase, reconcile, both demand blood. But whose? The empire is not ink, and I am not a page." The hall grew colder as he spoke. Meris knelt, comet wires sparking in her hair. "My lord," she said, "if the double carries your name, then loyalty will fracture. Some will follow him. Some will follow you. What law binds us when two suns rise?" Seraphil lifted her to her feet. Not law, he answered. Memory. We are bound by the weight of what we have lost, not the illusions of what we might gain. But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed unease. The word carved into metal, betray, had settled under his skin like frost. He turned to Ilith. You wrote the gate, he said. Tell me, was it invitation or warning? She did not look away. It was a mirror, she whispered. I carved what I saw in your silence. Betrayal was already in you. I only taught the door to speak it aloud. Kyle's jaw tightened, and his hand twitched toward his sword. But Seraphil only closed his eyes, as if hearing his own pulse testify against him. The court rustled. Some nobles slipped away to draft secret letters. Others whispered prayers that smelled of ambition more than faith. Above them, the ash sky rumbled, the pyre's smoke bending as though something vast shifted beyond sight. Iriel touched Seraphil's arm. If the double is not a ghost, but a road you did not walk, then it walks still. He will gather the discontented. He will promise them release from your silence, and they will believe him, for betrayal is a sharper word than loyalty. Then let him gather, Seraphil said, opening his eyes. I will not hunt a shadow yet. If he is me, he knows I wait. If he is not, he will learn why I am still here. His words had the weight of command, but beneath them a tremor. The cliff had heard the sea's appetite and did not know if stone would hold. Night approached though the sun had not finished its course. Torches bloomed in the courts, casting murals into restless ghosts. The Silix delegation lingered, scribes scratching quick notes in the margins of air. Vera approached Seraphil once more. You have signed our ledger, she said. But if two Seraphils exist, which signature will we honor? He looked at her and gave the smallest, coldest smile. Honor the one that bleeds. The other will offer you only arithmetic. Later, alone in the balcony of fractured stars, Seraphil leaned upon the stone. Cal joined him silently. They watched the ash plain, where fires flickered in patterns not sanctioned by the court. Small camps, small lights, too many. Carl's voice came low. They are already gathering. Seraphil did not answer. His hand pressed the cold balustrade until bone protested. Finally he spoke. Carl, if I fall into the ring, if I become only the wall that pretends to be a door. His voice faltered, and the silence was heavier than iron. Then you must be the cliff that breaks me. Carl closed his eyes. The oath tasted of salt and blood, of a promise he had hoped never to keep. I swore to guard you, he said, not to destroy you. Seraphil turned to him, gaze sharp with sorrow. Guarding me may one day mean striking the blow no one else will dare. Kyle looked into his master's face and saw the double lurking there, patient, inevitable. He bowed his head, and silence became assent. In the halls below, Ilith sang to herself, a line of prophecy too soft for others to hear. When the shadow drinks the name must bleed to live. Meris wept beside her, though she did not know why. Vera's abachi clicked through the night, and Iriel marked the stars, finding that several had gone missing from the ledger of heaven. The Empire slept uneasily, some dreaming of salvation, others of knives. Seraphil remained upon the balcony until dawn threatened, staring at the horizon where a second fire now burned brighter than the first. The pyre's hymn faltered, as if even the flames doubted which master they served. He whispered, not to Kale, not to Ariel, not even to himself, but to the air that carried both truth and treason. Betrayal has a face now, and it wears my own. The bells tried to keep courage in the city, but their notes rang hollow. The double walked somewhere beyond, gathering breath and rumour, and every shadow grew longer as if preparing to host him. The ash plane whispered its arithmetic. Seraphel did not move, did not rest, did not close his eyes. He stood as if waiting to be named again, by friend or by enemy, by loyalty or betrayal, by the cliff or by the sea. Dawn limped into Moen like a veteran returning to a house that had learned other laughter, and the palace woke to a hush, too careful to be peace. Seraphel left the balcony only when the bells cracked their own courage and walked the cloisters with Kale and Iriel close, the three of them moving as a single argument that had not chosen its verdict, while below the parapets, the ash plain stippled with clandestine lanterns that stitched rumours into temporary towns, and every wavering light looked like a prayer wrapped around a knife. In the Hall of Salt, the loyal and the merely frightened pretended to be the same creature, and Meris came forward with comet wire dulled by worry to press a reliquary into Seraphel's hand, a bead of stair-glass that remembered laughter he had misplaced, while Illith stood beside her like a kept storm, eyes shadowed by sleepless prophecy. Vera of the ninth account arrived last, with scribes who wrote invisible columns in the morning, praising patience while offering to exchange it for guarantees, and Seraphel said guarantees required coherence, that two signatures with one name turn ledgers into theology, and Vera's abachi clicked the soft sound of rain persuading dust. Then Lord Andon of the Inland Engines entered, wearing a coat of lacquered plates stamped with ownership sigils, soldiers at his flanks, whose boredom meant decisions had already been taken, and he did not bow but smiled with the exactitude of a machine, announcing that the Empire must retire the ring and adopt the line, for production required a horizon that did not curve back upon itself, unfurling diagrams that drew straight corridors through the old districts like blades through soft bread, promising fewer pyres and cleaner numbers if the city would surrender its habit of returning to what it loved. Seraphel watched the diagrams pass over neighbourhoods that still smelled of brine and cheap hymns, over circles where children played at planets, and he saw the sincerity within the cruelty, an arithmetic sincerely designed to spare a future that would forget its debts. And he asked what price the other Seraphel demanded for this mercy, and Andon answered with comfortable brevity. The immurance sealed, the Silex granted authority to audit borders like veins, and the choir reduced to state tone. At that, Meris trembled, saying the proposal ground people down into clocks that could be wound but not woken, and Illith's voice, dry as scraped stone, added that rest purchased by forgetting became a corridor without windows, at which Andon sighed that art must serve agriculture, and Vera observed that a stable unit of value preferred silence to song. Karl finally moved like a cliff that had listened too long to waves, planting his shield between Andon's smile and Seraphel's name, and asking the old question of the new morning, friend, rival, or rebel. And Andon answered rebel with an almost courteous nod, saying his rebellion aimed not at the man, but at the echo that refused to become a human hour. Whereupon his soldiers unlatched their boredom and drew steel that remembered how to finish sentences. The hall inhaled. Iriel's lamp wrote new angles in the air. Illith's deliberate keening loosened the wrists of those about to strike, and Seraphel closed his fingers on stair-glass until the bead burned cold, then opened his hand and told the room that rest bought with forgetfulness costs more than sleep can pay, that mercy measured only in heat and grain chooses the wrong winter, that following a name wearing his face but not his remorse would starve them with full bellies, and that he would not strike first. Andon bowed as if approving the elegance of refusal, and said the radiance would lose the room, then gestured, and his line of soldiers advanced with the clean appetite of a profession, while Curl answered like coastline, breaking and returning, bruised but unbroken. And Iriel tapped patterns into armor with the lamp's iron throat to make memory hesitate, while Illith let a minor prophecy unfurl just enough to move blades a thumb's width, shy of organs, and Vera recited 3 numbers that made men remember their children for exactly the heartbeat required to drop points toward flagstones instead of flesh. When the shock fell back, the murals had shed more paint, and a flake curled from the scene of the stair to reveal wood beneath, old and dark as stern affection, carved with names of the forgotten dead whose absence the hall had been built to celebrate. Seraphil touched the exposed grain and felt it warm. Felt, just for a breath, the living timber. Of the city answer a palm it remembered from other hours, and spoke aloud that they would not leave, not for a cleaner ledger nor a wider road, and the false problem cracked down its spine like plaster unlearning its courage. Further noise rose from the courts as word of rebellion loosened from tethers and streaked across the day, and envoys began moving like chess made of bone, and in the small chapel of broken oaths, Merises knelt to bandage a cut on the wrist of a soldier who would shortly desert, and whispered to the blood that betrayal is only loyalty in a mirror, and the blood reluctantly agreed. Illith found Seraphel again, and gave him a single unadorned note that meant go, and he understood her to mean go inward, not away, and so he climbed with Kale to the roof where the ash light kept changing its mind, and looked on the plain where a second fireline now burned, the camps of the double drawing near like a thought deciding to speak. And he told Kyle in a voice that kept breaking in the same place that if he became only the ring, if he turned wall and called it door, Kyle must be the cliff that shattered him, and Kyle said the oath had been to guard, not destroy. And Seraphel answered that guarding would one day be spelled with a blade. Toward evening, as dust halos formed around every helm and word, a small delegation approached under a white cloth that had already learned surrender's weight, and from it stepped a child with ink-blackened fingers, who carried an ordnance stamped with a double sign, a circle scratched into a straight line, as if by a nail dragged along an old table. And the child spoke the memorized sentence. The army of relief pledges to unburden Moen of circular waste, requests entry by dawn, and offers amnesty to those who accept the new measure. Kyle took the parchment and thanked the messenger with bread. Iriel looked to the horizon and counted silences between the distant drums. Vera tallied how many would trade memory for certainty before full dark, and Meris whispered that she would stand with whoever bled first, because bleeding counted more than signatures. Night gathered, loud with moths and quiet with fear, and Seraphel convened his council not in the hall of murals, but in the narrow room behind the revealed wood, where names of the dead were carved with the honest tremor of grief. And there he set the bead of glass on the table, and said he could not promise victory or purity, only endings carried properly, and asked each what they sought in the ruin to come. Kel sought permission to hesitate exactly once, and was denied by his own mouth. Iriel sought a grammar for mercy that did not excuse. Vera sought a signature that would still be legible after fire. Meris sought a kindness that could survive being unpopular. Illith sought a future that would sing without being told. They each received a fraction and called it sufficient for now. Outside the plane answered with a long, low thunder that had nothing to do with weather. And above the city, the pyre tilted its hymn as if to listen harder, and Seraphel told the wind He would not surrender the ring to those who wanted only the line, nor keep the ring if it forgot to open. And he walked out to the parapet, raised his voice the way a hand raises a fallen friend, and gave the order the Empire had dreaded and required in the same breath. Bar the gates gently, light no celebratory fires, leave the doors to the old districts unshuttered, and if the Double's army comes as a straight road, make them step around the circles where our children learn planets, for we will fight without erasing ourselves. Night fell like a verdict with no clerk to record it, and Moen held its breath until even the torches dulled from embarrassment, while Seraphil paced the parapets with Kal and Iriel, 3 silhouettes braided by ash and doubt. Below, the gates were barred as instructed, gently, with padded ropes and hinges soothed by oil, so that a closing sounded like a lullaby rather than an insult. Alleys kept a stitch loose for the desperate and the brave. Beyond the walls, the plain glittered with disciplined fires, the Double's encampments drawn in ruler-straight avenues, each blaze equidistant, as if warmth itself had been audited. From that geometry drifted the night's first message. 9 voices in white, 9 in iron, 9 in ash, speaking the ordnance like a catechism. Open by dawn, yield the immurent to audit, repave the circles into corridors, disband the choir, receive bread, receive sleep. Seraphil listened with the patience reserved for rain that has not yet chosen to fall, and answered in the tone the wall preferred. "We will not erase ourselves to become efficient," he said, and the torches along the parapet nodded like elderly judges. Kal stood as coastline, shield ready for sentences written in steel. Iriel cradled the lamp in damp cloth, nursing a restless flame that had learned humility. Towards second dark, a subtler petition rose from the plain, a chorus of familiar names asking entry, because winter had arrived early and children had found fear. Kyle recognized 3 and wanted to burn with them, but Ilith, standing at the stair with her throat bruised by honest music, sang 2 thin notes that let the lie unmask itself. The mouths behind the names were taut and metal, practiced for chewing. The gates held gently. A woman arrived alone with a jar of moths and asked that they be given to the city for luck. Seraphil accepted the jar and released its pale cargo over the pyre, and the moths wrote shy constellations before they decided on darkness and were gone. Before dawn, the likeness himself advanced, helm beneath his arm as Kale often bore it, eyes tidy with distance, patience combed flat. He halted 100 paces from the mid-gate so the arch could hear, and asked in Seraphil's voice whether Moen wanted rescue or memory. "Both," Seraphil replied, "but not at the price. You wrote." "I rewrote nothing," the Double said. "I signed where you hesitated." He lifted a hand, and the camp lights aligned behind him into the suggestion of a crown that did not circle but spanned, a bridge of fire across obedience. "At dawn," the likeness said, "we correct the line." Then he withdrew, and drums arranged the silence into squares. The first strike fell on the east gate like a straight sentence. It was not a ram, but a choir of tuned bolts. Numbers hurled at stone until angles remembered they could break. Kal met it with shield and vow, his phalanx moving in the old circles, guiding the assault into arcs that bled its certainty. Iriel ran the parapet with the lamp, breathing a scribble of doubt into the air each time courage tried to petrify. The flame painted hesitation in the eyes of men born for lines. A second strike crept where kindness lives. Parchment slid beneath doors promising amnesty to any who opened a shutter only a hand's width. In 3 houses on the south climb, fingers obeyed. The measured air entered, and with it came a sleep that folded names. When Seraphil stepped inside the first threshold, the family had forgotten mother and son. They smiled with industrious serenity and asked where the accounts office lived. He bowed to them and wept where they could not see. Ilith sang a hair-thin counterspell that stitched labels back onto 2 of their memories. The third refused its thread. "Keep the shutter wide," she told Seraphil quietly, "or it will learn to love the seam." By mid-morning, the ash learned to fall in straight lines, and even the pyre burned like a page under a ruler. The double unveiled engines that projected corridors across courtyards, forcing defenders to march as though drawn by invisible quills. But Moen was a city of circles and mourners, and the children who had once played planets taught the fighters to pivot, to slip, to feed the corridor too much curve. Meris moved among them like a comet corrected, throwing loops of wire that snagged command verbs from officers' mouths, leaving orders to stumble into gentleness. Vera, dutiful and grim, walked the inner wall, reciting 3 numbers that made panic remember its children. Sometimes arithmetic is a lullaby. At noon, the likeness returned beneath a flag-cut square from measured cloth, requesting parley at the mid-gate, where the mural had flaked to reveal carved wood, veined with names of forgotten dead. Seraphil stood with his back warmed by that grain, while the double outline mercies, the immurance sealed, the choir limited to comfort rather than change, Moen redrawn into corridors, Karl promoted to chief of gates, Iriel retired to archive, Meris sent to teach wire to straighten. "Say yes," the likeness urged, "and your people sleep." "They will sleep without dreams," Seraphil answered, "and dreamlessness is a famine of the heart." Kyle asked the only honest question left. Whom would the likeness betray first to keep the promise of sleep? "Whoever wakes," the double said, and smiled with their shared mouth. The parley ended when Eilith's smallest truthful note cracked a nearby helmet with lightning gentler than rain. No one had to decide whether it was an omen. So the day lengthened into a held breath that learned to fight. The third strike masqueraded as mercy, a convoy of bread and water driven by faces the city knew. Karl ordered the bars to hold, but Seraphil descended alone and unlatched a single door with the tenderness he had commanded. He carried loaves into the first courtyard and spoke names that belonged to the bread. Fields, berths, laughter beside the stair, reminding the walls who had baked them. The convoy's leader, a miller who had taught Seraphil to count by kernels as a boy, looked at him without recognition and asked for a receipt. Seraphil signed the air. Iriel touched the water jars with his lamp and let memory warm them. Those who drank recalled one true thing about themselves and began to cry, which is also a kind of defense. By late light, the attacks lost elegance and gained appetite. Lines pressed at the north climb. Circles yielded, then rolled closed again like eyelids that still believed in dawn. Kyle fought until his shield felt like a coastline eroded to its last honesty and, in the brief privacy between volleys, whispered that he understood the order he might one day have to execute and hated the precision of that knowledge. Seraphil pressed his brow to battered bronze and said, "Not while I remember endings properly." Evening crept in with moths and the smell of iron asking to be forgiven. Envoys ventured a final bargain. Open the immurant for inspection. Let the double witness the ring's silence. Prove there is no tyranny hiding in eternity, and the corridors would withdraw. Seraphil almost consented, thinking of frostbitten lanterns inside halted hours. Then he remembered the family that had forgotten its words, and said he would open the ring only to those who meant to learn endings, not to rename them. The envoy folded away her measured smile and retreated into squares. Night rose again. From the camps came a hymn engineered to the heart's mechanical pace. On the walls, Illith met it with a melody that leaned, faltered, refused to conclude. 2 songs wrestled over Moen until the stars themselves seemed undecided. At last, the likeness spoke across the dark with their one shared voice. At dawn, a final line. Seraphil rested his hands on the carved wood of the mural and felt it heat with the remembered touch of grief. He told the wall, and through it the city, a last instruction for the night. Do not harden into cruelty. Do not open from fear. Keep a stitch loose for the desperate and the brave. Moen breathed with him. Far off, a drum stumbled, remembering that it had once been a heart, and the embers arranged themselves into a horizon that promised arithmetic. Kyle kept watch like a cliff rehearsing collapse. Iriel trimmed the lamp to a patient star. Seraphil closed his eyes and saw the balcony of halted hours within the immurent, lanterns frosting around faces he could not carry, and he swore that if dawn demanded betrayal to keep the city whole, he would betray himself before he betrayed their names. Dawn came not as light, but as an argument between 2 hungers, one written in squares across the plain, the other curled in circles upon Moen's walls. The doubles' camps straightened their fires into a blazing ledger, every flame a column, every shadow a neat subtraction. Within the city, the pyre still sang, but its song was hoarse, the notes dragging as though even fire doubted its own grammar. Seraphil rose from stone, where sleep had not touched him, hands braced on the carved wood of forgotten names, and looked to Kale, who stood armoured like coastline, battered but patient. It will break today, Seraphil murmured. Kyle answered without lifting his eyes from the horizon. So will we. The first charge came as dawn's breath. From the Double's army marched ranks in exact formation, shields locking into corridors that sought to funnel Moen into silence. Their drums matched the pulse of a measured heart, and above them standard banners hung stiff, bearing a circle cracked open into a line. From the walls, Moen answered, not with neat ranks, but with curves and pivots, arcs of defenders weaving like planets around a sun. Children who had grown into soldiers shouted the names of games they once played, moving as orbits rather than regiments. Cal led from the forefront, shield angled, blade slashing where order demanded surrender. Each clash of steel became thunder in the throat of the city. Iriel moved along the battlements with the lamp, its light darting like a restless question. He pressed its flame against the air, and for a heartbeat the double soldiers faltered, their corridors bending, forgetting the straightness they worshipped. A hesitation is enough, he whispered, then wiped sweat from his brow as though mercy were heavy. Meris threw loops of comet wire that caught officers' commands mid-air, twisting them into nonsense that sent troops colliding against one another. Vera counted aloud. 1, 2, 3. And each number snapped panic into momentary obedience, keeping the defenders from unraveling. But the likeness came too. He strode at the center of his line, helm beneath his arm, face an echo perfected. When he raised his hand, the armies aligned like ink across a ruled page. His voice rang out in Seraphil's own tone, though stripped of weariness. Yield and sleep. You fight not me, but rest. Moen's walls groaned under the pressure. Masonry cracking where numbers pressed against memory. In the southern district, shutters broke open under false mercy. Envoys bearing bread walked unarmed into courtyards, offering loaves that smelled of past winters. Desperate hands reached, but Illith sang her thin note, and half the loaves crumbled to ash. "Memory spoils when baked with deceit," she said, her throat raw, and those who listened pushed the false mercy back into the street. Still, some ate, and their eyes glazed into sleepwalking serenity. Seraphel descended into one of the courtyards, lifted a loaf that remained whole, and broke it in his hands. "Bread must recall the field, or it is stone," he said, and fed pieces to those who still remembered hunger as more than arithmetic. The likeness pressed harder, his corridors narrowing into spears. Kyle's shield split on the fifth volley, edge bitten by orderly blades. He dropped it and fought bare-armed, roaring like surf that refuses subtraction. Ariel caught him before he fell beneath a dozen spears, swinging the lamp until light became a wound in their formation. For a moment the corridors buckled, and Moen's defenders surged, pushing them back from the mid-gate, yet the likeness did not falter. He called out across the clash, "Brother, why do you chain them to circles? Endings can be erased. Sleep can be perfect. They follow me because I am you without hesitation." His words slashed deeper than steel. Seraphel felt his name tremble inside him, heard the echo of lanterns frosting in the Immurant's silent hall. Was he the hesitation, or the refusal to erase? He gripped the bead of stair-glass in his palm until its cold bit his skin. From the north came a fresh assault. Engines dragged forward on straight rails, projecting corridors that forced Moen's streets into unnatural lines. Houses bent, arches strained, murals cracked under the imposition of geometry. Children wept as their playground circles snapped into squares. Meris climbed a parapet, her hair sparking with comet wire, and flung a coil into the engine's gears. Sparks bloomed like stars rediscovering themselves, and one machine screamed as if ashamed of obedience. She fell with it, swallowed by smoke, and her scream was a vow unfinished. Seraphel saw her fall and felt the Empire's blood pool in his throat. He turned to Kale. "We cannot hold the gates forever. If they enter, they will unmake us." Kale's voice was gravel. "Then meet him. End the corridor at its author." So Seraphel descended, stepping through cracked murals and scattered ash, until he stood at the broken mid-gate where carved names burned faint beneath his hand. Across from him waited the likeness, blade drawn, eyes steady with a mercy too precise to forgive. The armies stilled, two tides halting before the pull of a greater current. "Come," said the double. "Choose the line." Seraphel raised no weapon. He only held the bead of stair-glass aloft, letting dawn strike its surface until it glowed like a captured laugh. "You are me without hesitation," he said, "but I am me with grief. And grief is a circle that does not close. It widens, and in widening, it keeps the dead near." The likeness stepped, closer, blade angled for the heart. "Then betray yourself. End the grief." Carl shouted, but Seraphel lifted a hand to silence him. The city waited. Even the ash seemed to hold still in the air. He placed the bead against his chest, over his heart, and spoke low enough that only the double could hear. "If betrayal is inevitable, let it be mine against myself, not against them." For a breath, the likeness faltered. His blade wavered, not from weakness, but from recognition, as if some lantern within him recalled its frost. The hesitation lasted only a moment, but it cracked the corridor of his will. Moen's defenders surged into the gap, shouting names of their dead, pressing the line back a step. The likeness snarled, striking again, and Carl met him, steel against steel, cliff against tide. Their duel roared beneath the burning banners, sparks scattering like omens. Seraphel stood between them and the gate, the carved names searing against his back, knowing that the battle had only paused to choose its next shape. Above them, the pyre guttered, its hymn choking, and the ash sky whispered that dusk would fall red with endings yet to be decided. Moen endured another day, but dawn had promised nothing but more betrayal to come. The duel unstitched the morning into sparks and shouts, each strike between Karl and the likeness writing a sentence across the mid-gate, while Seraphel leaned on the carved names that warmed his back like stern affection. Steel argued. Karl moved as coastline hammered honest, the likeness as a river insisting stone must become a corridor. Ariel ghosted between them, lamb-sketching hesitation into the ordered ranks. The flame stung and learned humility. When the blades locked, silence gathered like breath held by a city. Then sound returned, and armies rushed to finish a thought their captains could not. Meris rose from smoke with wire blistering her palms, snaring command words. Vera counted panic down to a number small enough to carry. Illith peeled a hair-thin song into the air until hard men remembered soft names. The likeness stepped back, not yielding, but measuring. Seraphel did not raise a weapon. "Yield the ring," called the likeness in a voice exact and emptied of ache, "and your circles may survive as ornaments." "No," Seraphel said. "Ornaments are permitted memories." Engines unscrolled rails and imposed corridors. Doors forgot themselves and learned to be gates. The phalanx bent, then curled. Children who had learned planets shouted orbits to grown soldiers, and the streets moved like a solar system refusing a ruler. Karl's shield split along an old scar. "Hold while you can," Seraphel told the walls, and the walls groaned in the language of weight. Envoys returned with bread smelling of peace. Some shutters unlatched a cautious width. Illith sifted the loaves with a note. Half fell to ash, half held. "Refusal is not enough," Ariel said, ash on his mouth like an unconfessed word. "Then we open the place where I learned refusal," Seraphel replied. He gathered Kyle, Meris, Illith, and Vera in the chapel of honest wood. "Tonight I open the immurent," he said. "Not to them," Kel warned. "To one of us," Seraphel answered, "so you will know what I refused. The ring must hear only grief." At moonrise he and Ariel entered, while Kyle kept palm on steel. Meris whispered a knot that would loosen when forgiveness remembered itself. Vera measured heartbeats as signatures. Lanterns of halted hours swayed. A mirror throbbed without reflection. Ariel set his lamp in a curve, and the frost approved by creaking like an old book. A door presented itself like a polite wound. Beyond waited a chair built from patient absence, surrounded by ledgers written in breath. "If you sit," Ariel whispered, "the city will forgive you by forgetting you. Mercy without cost. Neat where it ought to be kind." Seraphel touched the chair. The ledgers trembled like animals discovering weather. "No," he told the furniture, the room, his own hunger. "Teach me mercy that remembers." They pressed their hands until absence fractured. The chair fell into curved splinters, and a lantern above them thawed long enough for a face to sleep like a child expecting morning. "We closed a kindness that lied," Ariel said. They emerged before dawn, lashes white with frost. "What changed?" Kyle asked. "The ring will not spare me from faces," Seraphel answered. Drums squared themselves beyond the walls. The likeness advanced with engineers and treaty, offering mercy perfected into cruelty. "Open to me," he demanded. and I will see whether your eternity is a wound." "You may look only if you mean to carry it," Seraphel replied. Kyle raised a new shield made from patience. Meris dragged a net of wire until geometry tripped. Vera counted frightened breaths into courage. Illith cracked a square into rain. The corridor aimed for the Immurant faltered, then straightened, then broke where children chalked planets and refused to move. The likeness stood beyond reach, helm under arm, eyes tidy with distance. "All you must surrender is memory," he called. "Then I remain bound," Seraphel said, and the wood behind him warmed in agreement. Corridors arrived like drought. Circles replied with stubborn rivers. Vera wrote down names and returned them like receipts. Illith sealed a shutter wide so no seam could seduce it again. At last, the drums became one square heartbeat. Corridors narrowed into a brilliant spear at the mid-gate. "There," Cal breathed. Seraphel touched his shoulder. "Not alone." They stood together, cliff and shore, while Ariel fed the lamp a splinter from the broken chair. The flame brightened without hardening. When the spear struck, it met not a wall, but a door open toward grief. The blow poured through, robbed of certainty, and the street drank it like sand. The likeness halted. A cart, overturned, bread scattered. A child ran beneath banners that did not know how to bend. Carl moved first. Seraphel followed. Ariel thrust the lamp down so both hands could carry. They reached her as the corridor re-knit. Seraphel raised the child, and every square in sight learned a circle. Silence fell like snow lit from within. The likeness watched, expression unreadable, as if an equation had introduced him to its mother. "You spend yourself on interruptions," he said. "That is what lives are," Seraphel answered, teeth red with the price of tenderness. Dusk bled into the plain. The camps drew back one measured field, not defeated, but thinking. Moen lit lamps in curves. On the parapet, the bead cooled in Seraphel's palm, like a small planet. "Tomorrow he will bring a mercy-wearing armor," he said. "We must decide how much of ourselves we can afford to save." From the dark, the likeness promised like weather choosing a direction. At dawn, no more circles. Seraphel pressed the bead to his heart and felt the Immurant answer with a slow, sorrowful thaw. At dawn, he whispered to the names behind him. "We teach the line to bend, or break with it." Carl's oath sat heavy as bronze. Ariel's bandage smoked. Meris tightened her wire until it hummed. Vera's abachi clicked like distant rain, and Illith held an unspent note between her teeth, while the drums outside gathered into a shape that wanted to be fate. Dawn broke like a blade cooled too quickly, hard at the edges and brittle in the heart, and the camps beyond Moen straightened their fires into sermons of squares, while the city lit its lamps in curves that refused to become corridors. Mercy arrived wearing armor. Tall engines swaddled in clean linen like traveling infirmaries, their ramps lowered in pious angles, each painted with the word relief, where a ram would usually boast a tooth. Voices drifted ahead like anesthesia. "Come out, lay down, sleep." And the ash itself seemed willing to be measured if only doing so would stop the ache. The likeness walked before the procession with helm beneath his arm and patience trimmed to an edge. He lifted a bare hand, and the engines halted at respectful distance from the mid-gate, as if kindness had learned etiquette. "I give you rescue," he called, and his voice made a straight road through the murmurs. "Let sleep take you. I will hold your name so you do not have to." Moen's walls breathed like tired animals. Seraphel answered with his palm on carved wood that warmed his hand as stern affection. You cannot hold what you have never carried, he said. Our names fit us because they have worn our weight. The gates remain barred yet unshuttered, the hinges oiled to close gently, if closing became a kindness. Iriel raised the lamp, and a tremor passed through linen ribs, as though a distant room remembered a death and refused to be polished into tidiness. We refuse anesthesia, he told the orderlies, but we accept bread that recalls the fields and water that recalls rain. The foremost orderly bowed with precision that hurt to watch. We recall what is useful, she said. Vera stood at Seraphel's side, Abachi clicking like rain, teaching dust to listen. Numbers prefer sleep, she murmured. Chaos spends poorly. So do graves, Maris replied, without lowering her gaze from the ramps. Let them count us angry. Never let them count us absent. Kyle planted his shield like coastline, testing how much tide the bronze would learn today. The first cart came forward despite the closed gate, guided by cords that tasted the hinge's doubts. Carl set his feet the way cliffs choose stubbornness over elegance. No further, he said, and the linen shivered as if cloth knew shame. An orderly descended with palms inked in the double's tidy sign. He will keep them safe from burning, from hunger, from the dreams that wake fighting. Kyle's eyes softened, then hardened. Safety that makes cowards of grief is only anesthesia by a holier name. At the south climb, a shutter that Moen had kept wide on principle clapped shut with a good, obedient sound. Elith's note jerked in her throat. She sang to pry the seam, but a contralto from within, tuned, perfect, engineered, met her with a lullaby that spoke rest like law. They are teaching our walls to sleep, she whispered, and felt her song fall from stone like a hand forgetting the hand it was meant to hold. Seraphel led them back to the chapel of honest wood and put his palm on the names. I open the immurent to one memory only, he said, through teeth that wanted to become prayer. Frost crept, reconsidered, and withdrew, and a door inside the door acknowledged grief as currency. He called a name he had never dared, his mother's, river salty, reed-scarred, extinguished in a season when mercy tended other gardens. A lantern thawed to a tremble. Outside, shutters paused mid-sleep. The lullaby faltered and forgot its key. With that small minute won, Kyle gathered the phalanx and the children who could still shout orbits. They swarmed the ramps, seizing bread and basins, carrying them not as tribute but as proof that charity must walk. Merises cast wire into engine joints until something important forgot which way was necessary, and one machine folded like a letter written in a language it had mislearned. Seraphel did not cheer. He was listening for a different sound, and it came from the inland engines. A patient thrum like arithmetic warming its hands. Lord Andan's banners appeared between camps and city, lacquered plates reflecting a future that would rather be metal than memory. He had chosen. He came beneath a white cloth that admitted victory without asking forgiveness. Radiance, he called. We bear a corridor neither circle nor square can refuse. The cloth fell. An instrument unrolled, slender as doubt, bright as a lie polished by good intentions. A beam maker that drew a single obedient line wherever it looked. Witness, Andan said, and the line touched a wall and erased history as neatly as chalk lifted from slate. Cal moved. The beam kissed bronze and made it colorless, honest as bone. He held anyway. Iriel thrust the lamp into light, and the flame guttered, then decided to survive out of rudeness. Ilith's note refused coherence, turning wild and unmarketable. Meris flung wire, and it hissed like rain on a forge but would not bite. Vera's beads froze mid-click. Then with a gasp, she snapped the strand, and beads rolled like small planets escaping gravity. "Enough," she said, and took her place with Seraphel. The likeness lifted a hand. "Do it." The beam brightened. A swath of wall went blank as a first day, and the city flinched like a body whose scar has been smoothed away against its will. Seraphel pressed the bead into wood. It burned cold. "If the line cannot learn to bend," he said, "then I will break where they expect me to stand." He stepped through the mid-gate alone, palms open, bead at his heart, grief in his mouth. The likeness descended, blade low, eyes refusing to be a mirror. Between them, the beam made a polished aisle. Seraphel did not raise a weapon. He opened the name he had called in the immurent and let it fall into the aisle like a small stone into a deep river. The line trembled. Somewhere behind Moen, a child began to cry the way stars do when novae teach them new grammar. The blank wall wrinkled into veins. Andan's instrument wavered. The likeness blinked, surprised to learn that some equations have mothers. "This is not strategy," he said, and almost sounded afraid. "No," Seraphel answered. "It is carrying." The engines shuddered, and the corridor frayed. Kyle roared a coastline's name, and the phalanx surged. Iriel lifted the lamp, and the flame laughed like someone who had earned it. Vera counted up instead of down. Maris screamed as her wire finally bit and held. Eilith's note climbed a stair no instrument had measured. The likeness raised his blade to finish the arithmetic, but Seraphel stepped within the geometry of inevitability and whispered where only their shared breath could hear. "If betrayal must happen, let it be mine against myself." The blade paused, no longer from weakness, but from recognition. And in that small hesitation, Moen made room for one more breath. The hesitation widened like a hairline crack admitting winter. And in that slender mercy, the corridor buckled, the beam maker's light blanching and then dimming as it remembered it had once been steel and not doctrine, while Moen drew a ragged breath and the pyre's hoarse hymn thickened into something almost brave. Kyle roared forward with the phalanx, like coastline finally allowed to enjoy the storm it had rehearsed all its life. Shields rounded, blades imperfect as good memories, and each impact turned a neat intention messy. Iriel ran, the parapet with the lamp, and sketched hesitation into the air so that ranks below stuttered, corridors kinking where certainty had been taught. The flame behaved like a stubborn child who loved its parents anyway. Maris rose suit black from a fallen engine and cast comet wire until commands tangled. Vera counted down 3 heartbeats and panic learned manners. Illith let a thread of song escape her teeth, and men who had slept on furnished promises remembered they owned names. The likeness stepped aside as a calculation revises itself, not retreating, but measuring. "Yield the ring," he called in Seraphel's unwearied voice, "and your circles may survive as ornaments." "No," Seraphel answered from the mid-gate, palm on the warmed wood of forgotten names. "Ornaments are permitted memories." The enemy's corridors narrowed into spears. Engines advanced beneath linen stamped with the word relief. "Mercy," their orderlies said, and their mercy had ramps. Lord Andan tore the linen from his engines and showed rams and rails polished like charity. He lifted a slender instrument and drew a strict white line through dust that had once been a doorway. Where it passed, stone forgot stories. Where it touched a mural, victory peeled like a reprimand. Kyle interposed shield and shoulder. Bronze heated, paled, held. Iriel thrust the lamp into that polished hunger, and the flame laughed out of rudeness. The line trembled, annoyed to meet something that remembered winter without loving it. The double soldiers pressed with clean appetite, but alleys bent like forgiving arms, and the children of Moen peeled chalk rings wider, inviting boots to step where planets used to turn. Some boots obeyed and forgot to march. Other boots remembered pay and pushed through. Blood took its tithe without asking why. Ilith dragged Seraphel behind a tilting cornice and shoved bread into his hand. "Eat," she said. "Sing with sugar in you." He chewed, and an old field introduced itself to his mouth. "I will not forget," he said around the bread, and believed himself for the length of that bite. Andan widened the beam until nuance burned. The line swept the mid-gate with a hunger born from mercy promised too long, and the honest wood smoked like a low room forced to say the wrong prayer. Seraphel pressed his bead of stair-glass to the whitening scar and spoke a list of names: fishers, nurses, mapmakers, those who laughed by the stair, and the bead cooled until the line hesitated, remembering that some walls are held up by grief. Kyle struck Andan's wrist. The instrument spun from lacquered fingers, shattered against stone, and lay there like a geometry that had forgotten who drew it. The camps wavered, not in formation but in meaning. Runners collided with instructions that contradicted etiquette. An engine reversed into its own rail and apologized to no one. The hymn of sleep flattened into human pitch. Ariel wiped tears from lamp glare and laughed once like a tired parent at a child who finally chose to nap. "The line is learning to lean," he muttered. Kyle's gauntlet closed on Andan's throat and pinned him to the wall where carvings sweated through white. "Mercies that cut are still knives," he said, voice like a cliff killing a wave by holding. "Yield." Andan showed good enamel. "The Radiance will bless me for making him necessary." Kyle's grip tightened until his oath trembled toward violence. Seraphel touched the bronze. "Cliff," he whispered, "not avalanche." Kyle let the man breathe, but not much. Vera wrapped the rebel's wrists with a string of counted knots and nodded, businesslike, at the ethics of restraint. The likeness watched with a face that tried and failed to remain a mirror. "Open the immurent to me alone," he said. "If I see what you carried and still choose the line, I will cut my corridor elsewhere." Kyle flinched. "Trap." Ariel frowned. "Test." Ilith, sugar on her lip, breathed. "Truth." Seraphel felt the bead cool like a small moon consenting to night. "Alone," he said, and the word landed heavier than armor. At dusk, he brought the likeness to the ring. Frost breathed under his palm, recognized the bead, and sighed. "One of us enters," Seraphel said. "One returns." "Or neither," the double answered, honest as tides naming cliffs. Kyle set his hand on steel. Ariel raised the lamp. Ilith held a note unspent. Vera's beads went quiet, unwilling to count what came next. The door unlatched like a polite wound. Cole drew near to weigh their names. Seraphel stepped aside. The likeness entered. The seal closed with the gentleness of a sentence that still knows it will hurt. Kyle did not breathe for 12 beats. Ariel began to count, then stopped, ashamed to make the moment arithmetic. Maris wound wire around her wrist to keep from interfering with sacred machinery. Vera rested her palm on honest wood and felt it answer with stern affection. Ilith whispered, "Let him learn endings." Time altered its gait and walked on its toes. The door sighed. The likeness emerged unarmed, helm forgotten. Eyes rhymed with a thin shame that becomes some men kindly and others cruel. He looked older by an argument's worth. "You refuse salvation because it would make you innocent," he said, not accusing. "Yes," Seraphel answered. "The innocent do not carry." The double's hand twitched, then steadied. He looked toward Moen and listened. The likeness stood with frost at the corners of his eyes, carrying not triumph, but recognition too heavy to name. Behind him, the camps kept their corridors stiff, though the line of their drums faltered, as if waiting for instruction that had forgotten itself. Seraphel faced him at the threshold of the immurent, bead cold at his breast, Cal and the others watching with weapons that wanted to act but could not yet understand what action would mean. For a moment no sound lived except the whisper of names carved in wood, steady and patient as the grave. "You have seen," Seraphel said softly, "and now you know why I could not yield. The innocent cannot carry." The likeness's mouth twisted as if into prayer, though no god stood near. I saw a chair that begged to erase its owner, and ledgers written in breath too weary to balance. I saw mercy that murdered memory. I saw you refusing peace so that grief might breathe, and I knew I was made from your refusal, not your strength. Cal moved a step forward, shield ready, voice stern. "Then end this now. Withdraw your corridors, burn your false ledgers, and let Moen remain whole." But the likeness only looked past him, toward the camps glowing with straight fires. "They will not follow if I abandon the promise. They dream of rescue, not burden. They want to sleep." "Then teach them how to wake," Iriel said, his lamp guttering but alive. "The smallest hesitation saved them today. Give them that gift." The likeness closed his eyes, and the air shifted like a corridor deciding to bend. Yet when he spoke, his words still cut. "I cannot betray them, but I can betray myself." He raised his blade, not toward Seraphel, but toward his own chest. Seraphel caught the wrist before steel found blood. Their pulses collided, familiar and wrong. "No," he whispered. "Endings must be carried, not discarded. If you are me, then live as my shadow, not my grave." The likeness trembled, then lowered the blade. In the camps, confusion rippled like wind in paper ranks. Orderlies glanced at one another. Engines paused mid-breath. A silence fell that was neither victory nor defeat, but a wound stretched wide. Illith sang a note, thin as a moth's wing, and the sound settled over them like dusk, choosing patience. Meris unwound her wire. Vera Zabachi clicked once, then stilled. The likeness stepped back from the gate. "At dawn, they will demand action. If I refuse, they will unmake me. If I comply, they will unmake you. Between us lies only betrayal." Seraphel touched his shoulder, sorrow heavy in his hand. "Then let us both betray ourselves until betrayal is emptied." The frost on the likeness's lashes melted into water. He turned away, walking toward his camp like a man already erased. Moen watched, waiting to learn what kind of dawn would come. Dawn arrived sullen, its light a thin geometry stretched over the ash plain, and in the camps the corridors trembled like lines doubting their ruler. The likeness stood before his soldiers with helm in hand, but his voice hesitated as if grief had found a tongue inside him. "We march," he said, yet the words did not cut clean. They frayed into silence, and silence is the mother of dissent. Orderlies glanced at engines. Engines creaked as though remembering other work, and among the ranks a single name was spoken. The Radiance. And it did not sound unanimous. Within Moen, the pyre burned, with a steadiness born from exhaustion. Seraphel kept vigil at the mid-gate, bead cold against his heart, Kyle at his side with shield cracked yet loyal. "He saw the immurent," Seraphel murmured, "and the frost broke his certainty." Kyle shook his head, but not his duty. He will still choose the line, because choice is all they trust. Iriel brought the lamp, flame restless as a child denied sleep. "Then we give them no corridor to march upon," he said. He traced shapes into the air, teaching the fire to wander. Circles bloomed on the dust before the gates, fragile but present. Children of the city followed, chalking orbits with quick hands. The ground itself began to resist straightness. At midday the likeness raised his blade, but his army faltered. Some pressed forward into the circles and found their steps bending. Others halted, staring at the wood of the gate, where names burned steady. A chant began, soft, uneven. Names of the dead carried across the plain. It was not a war cry, but a confession. The corridors broke rhythm. Lord Andon pushed through with his lacquered plates, fury neat as numbers. "Obey the line," he shouted, seizing the fallen instrument and drawing once more the cruel white stroke across the dust. The circles flinched, some fading, but Seraphel walked forward until the line touched his chest. He held the bead against it, whispering a list of names too long for mercy to erase. The line shook and sputtered, refusing to settle. The likeness lowered his blade. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I will not cut what grief protects." Soldiers looked to him, then to Andon, and confusion bred louder than command. Some fell back, others dropped arms. Andon raised the instrument higher, desperate. Kyle struck it from his hands, and it shattered on stone like chalk washed by rain. The camps dissolved into noise, not victory, not surrender, but disarray too human to be straightened. The likeness stared at Seraphel, eyes full of something close to mourning. "You have unmade me," he said. Seraphel shook his head. "No, you're always me. I only reminded you how to bend." The ash sky closed over them, and Moan breathed a fragile breath, knowing that dawn had offered no triumph, only another ending to carry. "You said, continue the story and write chapter 13 only. The chapter must be exactly 500 words, no more and no less. Follow and focus the command. Do not add any extra headings, summaries, or commentary. The tone should remain cinematic, immersive, and atmospheric, as if part of a film or audiobook narration. The writing must continue naturally from the previous chapters and stay fully aligned with the story's theme. Mark the chapter only with its number. Certainly 13, and then give the narrative prose. There will be no headings in script and script in the form of paragraph focus on command. ChatGPT said, "Night settled over Moen with the unease of an oath unspoken, and the city's lamps flickered like wounded stars refusing to abandon their posts. The camps beyond the walls had not dispersed, but their order was cracked. Corridors stumbled, drums lacked conviction, and the white linen of the relief engines hung slack, as if ashamed of their deception. In the chapel of carved names, Seraphel convened his companions, the bead of stair-glass lying between them like a cold heart. Cal leaned against the wall, armor split and eyes unblinking, the shape of the cliff waiting to fall if commanded. Ariel held the lamp, flame subdued, and murmured, "They will not remain in disarray. Tomorrow demands a conclusion." Vera's abachi whispered across her palms, and she broke a strand, scattering beads like planets loosed from orbits. Numbers show collapse when coherence falters. The question is whose collapse arrives first. Meris drew wire tight around her wrist until blood beaded. "Let it be theirs. My hands will not tremble again." Ilith stood apart, throat raw from prophecy, eyes shadowed. Collapse belongs to both. A mirror shatters from either side. Seraphel listened, his silence weight enough to bend the room. "The likeness is undone," he said finally, "but not gone. He carries my hesitation, and hesitation always returns. When he comes again, it will be with nothing left to lose." Kale's hand clenched around the hilt of his sword. "Then give the order. Let me be the cliff. But Seraphel shook his head. Not yet. The Empire is not preserved by victory, but by what remains after defeat. We must teach them how to endure endings without forgetting them. His gaze dropped to the bead, still cold, still patient. Tomorrow I enter the immurent again, this time not to refuse but to reveal. The council shifted in unease. Ariel lowered the lamp. If you open it fully, the city may drown in grief too vast to breathe. Better drowned in memory than suffocated by mercy, Seraphel replied. Illith touched her throat, voice breaking into a whisper. If you reveal it, the likeness will return. He is tethered to your choices. He will meet you in the frost, and one of you will not emerge. Silence thickened, broken only by the sound of Karl's armor creaking as he straightened. Then if you do not return, I will finish what he began, not to betray you, but to carry you. Seraphel's eyes lingered on him, sorrow and gratitude braided tight. Guard me still, even in ending. Beyond the walls the camp stirred, shouts rising as order reasserted itself. The likeness's voice carried across the ash plain, no longer hesitant, but sharpened by despair. At dawn we march not for mercy, but for finality. Seraphel closed his hand around the bead, and the carved names beneath him warmed as if approving his resolve. Then dawn will judge which of us can endure the weight of grief, he said, and the pyre outside shuddered, casting sparks into a sky that awaited betrayal. Dawn broke like glass in a clenched fist, the sky bleeding red into the ash plain as the likeness marched with his reformed host. No corridors this time, only a single advancing weight that sought to crush Moen beneath inevitability. Within the walls the pyre guttered but did not die, its flame ragged, whispering hymns too weary to be proud. Seraphel stood at the mid-gate with the bead in his palm and the immurent breathing frost behind him. Kyle took his place as cliff, shield raised though it was split, eyes resigned to fracture if it saved one heartbeat more. Iriel held the lamp close, flame skittish, and whispered to it as if to a child afraid of thunder. Meris wrapped wire tight enough to cut, her hands determined to snare even if they broke. Vera scattered beads at her feet, like offerings to chance. Illith pressed fingers to her throat, summoning a final note she feared would end her voice forever. The likeness halted within bowshot, helm beneath his arm, blade low. His army spread in silence, a tide without song. He looked to Seraphel, and for a breath grief softened his face. Then despair hardened it. There is no mercy left, he said. Only ending. I will be the one to carry it. Seraphel lifted the bead high so that dawn's fire struck its heart. Then carry me, he answered. But no grief does not yield. It widens. He turned and placed the bead against the immurent seal. The door sighed open like a wound learning to speak, and cold rushed through Moen. Lanterns of halted hours flared, every face Seraphel had lost burning in sudden clarity. The city groaned under the weight of memory, some weeping, some collapsing, some shouting names too long buried. The likeness strode forward into the frost. This is cruelty, he said. You burden them with sorrow until they drown. No, Seraphel replied, stepping into the immurance hall. I teach them that to drown is also to remember the sea. Kyle tried to follow, but Seraphel raised a hand. Cliff, hold the tide here. If I do not return, let my betrayal be mine alone. Kyle's vow choked, but he obeyed. Within the immurant the brothers met, two names circling one grief. Blades struck, but the frost muffled sound, leaving only the sight of sparks falling like frozen tears. The likeness fought with desperation, every swing an attempt to end the burden. Seraphel fought with sorrow, every parry a refusal to let go. "You cannot save them," the likeness cried. "Nor can you," Seraphel answered, "but we can show them how to endure." Their blades locked at the hall's heart, and the lanterns flared until the frost cracked. One name would leave, the other be carried. The immurent seal shuddered, and outside the pyre roared, scattering sparks like omens into the bruised dawn. The immurent cracked with the weight of their struggle, frost falling in shards that sang like bells when struck. Seraphel and his likeness circled one another in silence, broken only by the whisper of blades through frozen air, each movement mirrored yet burdened differently. The likeness fought as one who sought release, striking to end memory, to carve a corridor clean enough for sleep. Seraphel answered as one who bore the ache of names, turning aside each blow with sorrow rather than rage. Sparks leapt, lingered, and died between them like omens unfinished. The lanterns above them burned brighter, each face from Seraphel's past watching, demanding to be carried. He faltered under their gaze, knees bending, grief pressing like armor too heavy. The likeness seized the moment, blade poised for a killing stroke. "Endings deserve mercy," he cried, eyes wet with something perilously close to love. Seraphel caught the steel with his bare palm, blood searing against ice, and whispered through clenched teeth, "Mercy without memory is cruelty disguised." He twisted, forcing the blade aside, and drove his own into the likeness's chest. The frost screamed. The lanterns flared once, then guttered. The likeness staggered, smile torn between gratitude and despair. "You betrayed us both," he said, voice failing, "but you carried me." His body dissolved into snow that fell without wind, scattering across the hall. Seraphel collapsed to his knees, the weight of his act heavier than the immurent stone. Outside, the seal split open. Kyle staggered forward, shield hanging in ruin, Iriel clutching the lamp dimmed to its last spark. Meris, Vera, Illith, all waiting, breath held as if the city itself would stop should he not emerge. When Seraphel stepped through, blood dripping from his hand, their eyes told him what the pyre already sang. The likeness was gone, but his absence had not left victory, only a wound. The army beyond the walls broke without command. Corridors unraveled, drums faltered, and men dropped their arms as if the geometry of certainty had betrayed them. Lord Andon fled, the shattered instrument clattering useless at his feet. The plain emptied like a tide that had forgotten its moon. Moen remained, scarred and shivering, but unbroken. Seraphel raised the bead high once more. It was no longer cold, no longer bright, but dull as stone, its power emptied in the betrayal he had chosen. "We endure," he said, voice raw, carrying across streets and walls, not by erasing grief, but by holding it until the weight becomes our shape. The city bowed, not in triumph, but in weary assent. That night the pyre burned steady, neither hymn nor lament, only flame. Seraphel stood beside it alone, Kael at a distance, Iriel's lamp finally dark. He pressed the bead into the ash until it disappeared, leaving only heat. Above, the stars bent uncertainly, as though the universe itself had been asked to carry a grief it could not erase. Moen slept uneasily, but it remembered.